Margaret stood in front of the mirror, studying the reflection that stared back at her. The soft glow of the morning light revealed the fine lines tracing her face, the gentle sagging of her skin, the silver strands woven into her once dark hair. She ran a hand over her cheek, remembering a time when her skin was smooth, when she felt vibrant and full of life. But now, at 72, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. She sighed, adjusting the collar of her blouse, the weight of time pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just the physical changes that unsettled her, it was the feeling of slowly fading away. The world seemed to move on without her, and she wondered if she was becoming invisible, a shadow of the woman she once was. She had spent decades taking care of others, pouring herself into her career as a teacher, into her marriage, into raising her children. And yet, standing there alone, she felt as if she had neglected the one person who had been with her through it all, herself. The ringing phone jolted her from her thoughts. She reached for it, pressing it against her ear, and the moment she heard the voice on the other end, her heart clenched. It was the hospital. Evelyn, her closest friend of over 40 years, had suffered a stroke. The words hit Margaret like a blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She barely remembered grabbing her coat, barely noticed the chill in the air as she hurried out the door. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with memories of Evelyn, their long walks in the park, their laughter over coffee, the countless conversations about aging and the frustration of feeling like their bodies were betraying them. They had always joked about growing old together, about facing the inevitable with grace. But now, the thought of losing her felt unbearable. Margaret sat by Evelyn's bedside, holding her frail hand, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. When Evelyn finally opened her eyes, a weak smile crossed her lips. "We wasted so much time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "So much time worrying about things that never really mattered." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. She knew exactly what Evelyn meant. How many years had she spent criticizing her body, fighting against the inevitable changes, mourning the loss of youth? How many moments had she lost, trapped in the fear of becoming irrelevant, of growing old? She had spent so much time resisting time itself, as if she could somehow bargain with it. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Evelyn's words echoing in her mind. She had always thought of aging as a slow decline, as something to endure rather than embrace. But what if she had been wrong? What if there was another way to see it, not as a loss, but as a transformation? What if, instead of fighting against the changes in her body, she could learn to honor them? The next morning, as the sun rose, Margaret made a decision. She needed to find a different way to move through this stage of life. She needed to let go of the resentment she held toward her body, the disappointment she felt when she looked in the mirror. And so, for the first time in years, she did something unexpected. She visited a Buddhist temple. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that she was tired of carrying the weight of self-judgment. She needed to understand if it was truly possible to make peace with the body that had carried her through 7 decades of life. What she didn't realize was that this simple step would lead her on a journey that would change her forever. Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like you were staring at a stranger? Have you ever wished you could turn back time, undo the changes that life has left on your body? If so, you are not alone. But what if I told you that these changes are not something to fear, not something to fight against, but something to embrace? Stay with me, because this is a journey of acceptance, of transformation, of learning to see ourselves with new eyes. A journey that, for Margaret, started with loss but would lead to something far greater. And perhaps it is a journey meant for you too. Chapter 1, The Illusion of Perfection. Margaret had spent most of her life chasing an image of perfection that was never truly hers. As a young woman, she had absorbed the silent but ever-present messages of society. Beauty was youth, worth was tied to appearance, and a woman's value diminished as time etched itself onto her skin. She had done what so many women before her had done. She learned to measure herself by the mirror's reflection, to view her body not as a home, but as a project that always needed fixing. In her 20s and 30s, she had dieted and exercised. Not out of love for her body, but out of fear of what it might become if she let it change. She had stood in front of the mirror, pulling at her skin, wondering if she was thin enough, firm enough, attractive enough. She had believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she maintained a certain weight, a certain look, she could hold onto her youth indefinitely. But the illusion of perfection is a cruel trick. No matter how much she tried, time continued its steady march forward, indifferent to her efforts. The first grey hairs had appeared in her 40s, hidden at first but soon impossible to ignore. Then came the softening of her skin, the deepening lines around her eyes. She told herself it was normal, that she was aging gracefully, but deep down, she mourned. She felt betrayed by a body that refused to stay the way she wanted it to be. By the time she reached 72, the fight felt exhausting. She avoided mirrors, avoided photographs, avoided thinking too deeply about the reflection that no longer aligned with the image she had once held of herself. It wasn't vanity, not really, it was something deeper, something more painful. It was the realization that she had spent her whole life trying to hold on to something that was never meant to last. And in doing so, she had lost sight of something far more important. It wasn't until she visited the Buddhist temple that Margaret began to understand how much she had been clinging to an illusion. She had expected a place of quiet, of rituals and incense, of whispered prayers. But what she found was something unexpected, a woman, perhaps in her late 50s, sweeping the courtyard with slow, deliberate movements. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes shone with a calm Margaret had never known. The woman noticed her and smiled, gesturing for Margaret to sit with her on a bench beneath the shade of a large body tree. "You're troubled," she said gently, as if stating a simple fact rather than asking a question. Margaret hesitated. It felt foolish to voice what was in her heart. "I don't recognize myself anymore," she finally admitted. "I look in the mirror, and I see an old woman staring back at me. And I hate it. I hate that I feel this way, but I do." The woman nodded, as if she had heard these words 1,000 times before. "Why do you think it troubles you so much?" Margaret exhaled, her fingers twisting in her lap. Because I used to be beautiful. And now I'm not." The woman smiled, a kind of knowing smile that made Margaret feel both exposed and understood. "What if I told you that the idea of beauty you've been holding onto isn't real? That the pain you feel isn't coming from your reflection, but from your attachment to an image that was never meant to last?" Margaret frowned, unsure of how to respond. The woman continued, her voice steady and kind. "In Buddhism, we talk about impermanence. Everything changes, the seasons, the tides, the mountains, even the stars. Your body is no different. It was never meant to stay the same. It was meant to grow, to shift, to carry you through different phases of life. The suffering comes when we try to hold on to something that is meant to move." Margaret looked down at her hands, the skin thinner than it used to be, the veins more visible. She had spent so much time resenting these changes, resisting them, as if she could somehow stop the inevitable. But what if the problem wasn't her body? What if the problem was the story she had been telling herself about it? The woman gestured toward the body tree above them. "This tree was once a seed. Then a sapling. Now it stands tall, its branches wide and strong. Would you ever say it was more beautiful as a seed than it is now?" Margaret shook her head. "No, of course not." The woman smiled. "Then why do we say that about ourselves?" The question settled into Margaret's heart like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she had believed. She had always thought of aging as a decline, a loss of beauty, a loss of worth. But what if it was something else? What if it was simply transformation? What if, like the tree, she was still growing into something just as valuable, just as beautiful, just in a different way? For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something shift within her. The reflection in the mirror hadn't changed, but perhaps, just perhaps, the way she saw it could. Chapter 2, The Battle with Change. Margaret had always believed that if she followed the right routines, if she took care of herself the way she was supposed to, she could maintain some sense of control over her body. She had been disciplined, eating well, staying active, doing everything she had read in books about how to age gracefully. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of how her body changed over time, how it felt to wake up one day and realize that she no longer recognized the way she moved, the way she felt inside her own skin. The battle with change had not come all at once. It had arrived in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, a stiffness in her joints that lingered longer than before, a strand of hair thinner than it used to be, a moment of forgetfulness that made her pause. Then, the changes became more pronounced. Sleep eluded her, hot flashes came like waves crashing against her in the middle of the night, her emotions shifting in ways she couldn't explain. Some days, she felt like herself. Other days, it was as if she had stepped into the body of a stranger. She hated the unpredictability of it all. No matter how much she tried to resist it, her body had its own plan, its own rhythm, one that she could not control. She found herself growing resentful, frustrated by the feeling that she was losing a part of herself. She longed for the days when things had felt effortless, when she could wake up and trust that her body would do what she needed it to, without question. One afternoon, she found herself back at the Buddhist temple, drawn once again to the quiet presence of the woman she had met before. The woman, who Margaret now knew as Sister Ananda, welcomed her with the same gentle smile, as if she had been expecting her. They sat together beneath the shade of the Bodhi tree, and after a long silence, Margaret finally spoke. "I feel like I'm at war with my own body," she admitted. "Like I'm fighting something I can't win." Sister Ananda nodded slowly. "Why do you feel the need to fight?" Margaret frowned. The answer seemed obvious. "Because everything is changing, and I don't want it to. I don't want to feel weak. I don't want to feel lost in my own skin." Sister Ananda regarded her for a moment before reaching down and picking up a dried leaf that had fallen from the tree above them. She held it gently between her fingers. This leaf was once green, full of life, drawing energy from the sun. Now, it has changed, turned golden, brittle in my hands. Tell me, is it any less a part of the tree now than it was before? Margaret stared at the leaf, feeling the weight of the question settle in her chest. "No," she said softly, "Sister." Ananda placed the leaf in Margaret's open palm. "Change is not something to fight, Margaret. It is something to witness, to experience, to honor. Your body is not your enemy. It is simply following the path it was always meant to follow." Margaret swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. "But I don't know how to stop fighting," she admitted. "I don't know how to accept something that feels so out of my control." Sister Ananda smiled, a knowing warmth in her expression. "Then perhaps the first step is to stop trying to control it at all." For a long time, Margaret had believed that her strength came from maintaining control, from keeping herself together, from pushing forward no matter what. But now, sitting beneath that tree, with a leaf crumbling between her fingers, she wondered if real strength might look different than she had imagined. What if strength was not about resisting change, but about learning to move with it? That night, when Margaret returned home, she stood in front of the mirror once again. The face that looked back at her had not changed, but something within her had. She reached up and traced a fingertip over the lines that had deepened over time. She thought of the sleepless nights, the frustration, the silent grief she had carried for a version of herself that no longer existed. And then, for the first time, she whispered to reflection, "I see you. And I'm listening." The battle with change was not over, but perhaps it did not need to be a battle at all. Perhaps it was time to lay down her arms, to stop fighting a war that had never needed to be fought. Perhaps it was time to trust that her body, in all its transformations, still carried her forward, still held within it a life worth embracing. Chapter 3, Redefining Beauty and Strength. Margaret had spent decades believing that beauty was something external, something defined by smooth skin, firm muscles, and youthful energy. She had spent even longer believing that strength was measured by endurance, by how much she could push through, by how well she could maintain control. But as she sat on the wooden floor of the Buddhist temple, listening to the soft chants that filled the air, she realized that perhaps she had been measuring both beauty and strength in all the wrong ways. Sister Ananda sat beside her, her presence calm and steady. "Margaret," she said softly, "tell me, when do you feel most beautiful?" Margaret hesitated. The question was unexpected, almost unsettling. She thought back to the days when she had dressed up for dinners with her late husband, when she had received compliments on her youthful glow, when she had fit into the dresses that now hung forgotten in the back of her closet. But none of those memories felt entirely right. She searched deeper. She thought of the mornings when she sat by the window with a book in her hands, the sunlight warming her face. She thought of the way her grandchildren looked at her with adoration when she told them stories from her past. She thought of the nights when she had held Evelyn's hand, whispering words of comfort as her friend drifted in and out of sleep. Maybe, she said finally, maybe I feel most beautiful when I am needed. When I am able to give something of myself to others. Sister Ananda nodded. And strength. When do you feel strongest? Margaret exhaled slowly. She had always equated strength with pushing forward, with never showing weakness. But now, she wondered if strength was something else entirely. She thought of the nights she had spent alone after her husband passed, the way she had carried herself through grief even when it felt unbearable. She thought of the courage it had taken to walk into this temple, to admit that she was struggling. To seek a new way of seeing herself. I think, she said carefully, I think I feel strongest when I allow myself to be vulnerable. When I stop pretending that I have everything figured out. Sister Ananda smiled. Then perhaps it is time to redefine what beauty and strength truly mean to you. Margaret let the words settle in her mind, rolling them over like smooth stones. In her hand. For so long, she had tried to fit into a definition of beauty that was never meant to last. She had fought against time, believing that aging was something to resist rather than embrace. But what if beauty was not in the absence of wrinkles, but in the depth of a life fully lived? What if strength was not in the ability to fight change, but in the willingness to surrender to it? Later that evening, Margaret walked through the garden outside the temple, the air cool against her skin. She watched an elderly monk tending to the plants, his movements slow and intentional. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his hands rough with age, yet he moved with a quiet grace, his presence exuding a serenity that Margaret could not quite explain. Excuse me, she said, stepping closer. May I ask you something? The monk looked up, his smile warm. Of course. Margaret hesitated, then asked, do you ever miss being young? The monk chuckled, as if the question amused him. Ah, he said, youth is like the first sip of tea, fresh, bold, exciting. But tell me, do you only enjoy the first sip of your tea? Margaret thought about it for a moment. No, she did not. She enjoyed the way the flavors deepened, the warmth that lingered, the way the tea changed as she drank it. The later sips, the monk continued, are different, but just as valuable. They are richer, more complex. That is what aging is. A deepening of flavor, not a loss. Margaret felt something inside her shift. She had spent so much time longing for the first sip, for the youth that had once been hers, that she had not appreciated the richness of where she was now. She had overlooked the beauty in her laughter lines, in the wisdom she carried, in the gentle strength that had been forged through years of experience. That night, she stood in front of the mirror again, but this time, she looked at herself differently. She traced the lines around her eyes, remembering the countless moments of joy and sorrow that had shaped them. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm that had carried her through every triumph, every heartbreak. She was still here. Still living, still learning, still becoming. For the first time in years, Margaret did not see a woman who was fading. She saw a woman who was evolving, who was stepping into a new kind of beauty, a new kind of strength. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. Chapter 4, Living in Harmony. Margaret had spent most of her life trying to mold herself into something she thought she should be, someone younger, someone stronger, someone untouched by time. But standing on the temple grounds one quiet morning, she realized that for the first time in decades, she no longer felt the urge to fight. There was no battle left to win, no perfection left to chase. What she felt instead was something unfamiliar yet deeply comforting, a quiet acceptance. A kind of peace she had never known before. She walked along the garden path, feeling the cool earth beneath her feet, the gentle breeze against her skin. The world around her was in constant motion, the trees swayed, the river flowed, the leaves drifted lazily to the ground. Everything was changing, always changing. And yet, there was a harmony in it all, a rhythm she had never truly paid attention to before. If nature did not resist its own transformation, why had she spent so many years resisting hers? Margaret found Sister Ananda sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, hands resting lightly in her lap, eyes closed in meditation. She hesitated for a moment before joining her, settling onto the soft ground beside her. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the world, the rustling leaves, the distant ringing of a temple bell, the steady breath of life moving all around them. Finally, Margaret spoke. I used to think peace was something I had to chase, she admitted. Something I had to earn, like a reward for doing everything right. But now I wonder if it's been here all along, just waiting for me to stop running. Sister Ananda opened her eyes, a knowing smile touching her lips. It was never outside of you, Margaret. Peace is not something we find. It is something we uncover, something that has always been within us. Margaret thought about that, turning the idea over in her mind. She had spent so much time searching for happiness in the mirror, in the approval of others, in the idea that if she could just hold on to her youth a little longer, she would somehow hold on to joy as well. But joy had never been in the smoothness of her skin or the firmness of her body. It had been in the way she had laughed with Evelyn over a cup of tea, in the way she had held her newborn grandchild for the first time, in the countless moments of love and connection she had been too distracted to fully appreciate. That afternoon, she took a long walk through the city, noticing things she had never taken the time to see before, the way the sun painted gold streaks across the pavement, the sound of children laughing in the distance, the way the world kept moving with or without her approval. She stepped into a small cafe and ordered tea, cradling the warm cup in her hands, remembering the words of the old monk. Each sip was different from the last, but no less valuable. She had spent too much time mourning the loss of the first sip, not realizing that the later ones held their own richness, their own quiet beauty. Margaret no longer felt the need to fix herself, to hold on to something that was never meant to stay the same. She no longer saw her body as a reflection of what had been lost, but as a vessel that had carried her through a lifetime of experiences, of love and sorrow, of lessons and growth. She no longer feared the future, because she understood now that each phase of life brought its own kind of grace. One evening, as she was preparing for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. She no longer looked away. Instead, she met her own eyes, saw the woman she had become, the woman who had lived, who had loved, who had endured and softened in equal measure. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling its steady rhythm, and whispered to herself the words she wished she had spoken years ago: I am enough. I have always been enough. Margaret did not become a different person. She did not erase all traces of doubt or insecurity. But she had learned to walk beside them instead of letting them lead. She had learned that harmony was not about eliminating discomfort, but about making space for all of it, the joy, the sadness, the change, the unknown. For the first time in her life, Margaret was not at war with herself. She was at peace. And that, she realized, was all she had ever truly needed. Margaret sat on her porch as the evening sun cast long golden shadows across the yard. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves, a quiet reminder that another season was shifting, that change was always present, always unfolding. She held a cup of tea in her hands, feeling its warmth seep into her fingers, grounding her in the moment. She had spent so many years fearing time, fearing what it would take from her, fearing how it would reshape her body, her face, her place in the world. But now, she saw time differently. It had not stolen anything from her, it had given her depth, wisdom, and a quiet strength she had never known in her youth. The lines on her face were not signs of loss but of love, of laughter, of a life fully lived. The softness in her body was not weakness but evidence of the years that had carried her through countless moments of joy and sorrow. She no longer felt the need to chase who she had been. She was no longer mourning the reflection in the mirror, no longer longing for a past version of herself. Instead, she embraced the woman she had become, the woman who had learned, who had grown, who had softened into something more real, more authentic than she had ever allowed herself to be. As she took a slow sip of tea, she thought about Evelyn, about the promise she had made that day in the hospital. To live, not in fear, but in gratitude. To stop apologizing for the natural course of life, to stop seeing herself through the eyes of a world obsessed with youth. She had spent too much time resisting time's passage instead of honoring it. But not anymore. She looked up at the sky, watching as the last traces of sunlight melted into twilight. There was peace in knowing that life, like the seasons, was meant to change. And she was ready to embrace it all. If you have ever felt the weight of time pressing against you, if you have ever looked in the mirror and wished to turn back the years, I hope Margaret's journey reminds you of this: you are not fading, you are becoming. Every line, every change, every new season of your life is part of something greater, something beautiful. You are enough, just as you are, in this moment, in this body, in this life. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to carry its message forward. Share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you'd like to continue exploring stories of wisdom, mindfulness, and self-acceptance, I welcome you to join this community. Let us walk this path together with courage, with grace, and with the quiet understanding that every stage of life holds its own kind of beauty.